You won't believe how a simple trip back to my childhood home turned into a life I can never escape. My name is Nora, and I lived a life most would consider ordinary. I had a stable job in the city, a loving husband named Mark, and a routine that kept me sane. But all of that changed when my father passed away, leaving me the small ranch I grew up on. I hadn't been back in years, not since I was a teenager. I didn't think much of it at first. The plan was simple: sell the land, close this chapter, and return to my life. But the moment I stepped onto that ranch, I felt something stir deep inside me. Miles of empty fields stretched around me, the old barn looming in the distance, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. That's when I saw him. Near the fence stood the most breathtaking horse I'd ever laid eyes on. His coat was black as midnight, his mane wild and untamed, flowing like dark silk in the wind. Even from a distance, his presence was overwhelming, powerful, commanding. I couldn't look away. "Who's that?" I asked a ranch hand, an older man named George who worked here long before I was born. "That's Shadow," he said, spitting into the dirt. "Meanest stallion you'll ever meet. No one's been able to break him." I felt something shift inside me. Shadow wasn't just a horse, he was a challenge, something untouchable. And yet, I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. The connection was instant, a pull I couldn't explain. Over the next few days, I found excuses to be near him. I'd watch him from afar, brushing hay off my hands just so I had a reason to linger near the fence. He was wild, unpredictable, kicking at the ground, his ears flicking, his muscles rippling beneath his glossy coat. Every time he turned his dark eyes toward me, it was like he could see straight through me, past all the lies I told myself. And I liked it. I didn't tell Mark how much time I spent with Shadow. I didn't even know how to explain it myself. All I knew was that every moment with him felt forbidden, wrong in ways I couldn't admit. But I wanted more. That night, as I stood by the stable, brushing hay off my jeans, I whispered softly to him, "You're beautiful, you know that?" Shadow stomped his hoof in response, his tail swishing. And for the first time, he let me press my hand gently against his strong, heaving side. His warmth seeped through my skin, and for a split second, the world stood still. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my thoughts still tangled around Shadow. My husband Mark was out of town for work, which gave me an excuse to spend more time on the ranch without feeling guilty. I grabbed an old pair of gloves and a brush and headed straight to the stables. Shadow was standing near the far corner of his stall when I walked in, his dark eyes watching me like a predator sizing up its prey. My heart raced as I approached him, the silence in the barn broken only by the soft shuffle of my boots on the dirt floor. "Morning, boy," I said softly, my voice steady despite the nerves bubbling in my chest. He didn't move, just watched me. I took it as a challenge. I reached out, letting him sniff my hand. His breath was hot against my skin, sending a strange thrill through me. Slowly, I moved the brush to his coat, the first tentative strokes light and careful. He flinched at first, but didn't move away. "There we go," I whispered, a small smile tugging at my lips. "You're not so mean after all, are you?" His muscles twitched under my touch, but I kept going, brushing along the strong curve of his neck, feeling the power beneath his skin. Every ripple of his muscles, every rise and fall of his chest seemed to pull me closer, as if we were connected by something unseen. My hands lingered a little too long against his body, tracing the warmth of his shoulders. I shouldn't have. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't stop. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over those moments in the stable. My thoughts were consumed by him, his eyes, his strength, the way his body felt under my hands. It was dangerous, and I knew it, but every time I tried to push the thoughts away, they came back stronger. Late one evening, as the sky turned dark and the barn grew quiet, I found myself back in Shadow's stall. I don't know what I was expecting or what I wanted, but I couldn't stay away. The moment I touched him, his warmth spread through me again, and I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. "You're incredible," I murmured, running my fingers through his mane. He shifted slightly, his body pressing back against me, and my breath caught. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. For a moment, we were the only two beings in the world, the air thick with something I couldn't name but knew was forbidden. And yet, I couldn't pull away. The next few days passed in a haze, each moment pulling me deeper into something I couldn't understand, or maybe didn't want to. I found myself at the barn more than anywhere else, the pull toward Shadow becoming harder to resist. Mark called a few times, asking how I was settling into the ranch, but I brushed him off, my voice steady while my thoughts raced. One evening, after a long day of pretending to work on the property, I found myself back in the stable. The air was still, and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting golden streaks across Shadow's sleek, black coat. He turned his head as I approached, those dark eyes locking onto mine. There was something in his gaze, something knowing, something that made my heart pound against my ribs. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, the brush trembling slightly in my hand. "Hey boy," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "It's just me." He didn't flinch as I ran the brush along his back, slow and deliberate. Each stroke seemed to calm him, his muscles softening beneath my touch. I let my hand linger, brushing down the curve of his shoulders, then lower to the firm lines of his body. My breath hitched and I froze. I knew I should step back, but I didn't. My fingers trailed along his side, the heat of him seeping through my skin, sending a rush of something forbidden straight to my core. "What are you doing to me?" I murmured, more to myself than to him. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing against me, his strength overwhelming. My knees felt weak, my body trembling as I leaned closer. My cheek brushed against his warm neck, and for a moment, I let myself sink into him, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the quiet of the barn. The rational part of me screamed to stop, to leave, to lock these thoughts away forever, but I couldn't. The way he felt beneath my touch, the way he moved against me, it was like he knew. And I didn't want it to end. The door to the barn creaked suddenly, and I jumped back, my chest heaving as my mind scrambled for control. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and then I heard George's voice echo through the silence. "Nora, you still out here?" I pressed a hand to my mouth, biting back the breathless gasp that threatened to escape. Shadow snorted softly, as if he knew how close I had come to being discovered. "Yeah," I called out, forcing my voice to steady. "Just finishing up." George's footsteps paused, then receded into the distance. I exhaled shakily, leaning against the stall for support. I glanced back at Shadow, his dark eyes meeting mine again, unblinking, as though he held all my secrets. This was dangerous, whatever it was, whatever I was letting happen. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. The nights became my sanctuary. When the world was quiet, and the stars stretched across the sky, I'd find my way back to the stable. Each visit felt like stepping over an invisible line I couldn't see, but I could feel it tugging at me. Shadow was always there, waiting, his dark form blending into the shadows of the barn, as if he knew I'd come. That night, I brought a blanket and sat near the stall, watching him. The moonlight poured in through the cracks in the wood, catching the glint of his coat. He watched me, his gaze fixed and steady, like he understood something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. "Why do I keep coming back to you?" I whispered, my voice barely carrying through the still air. I didn't expect an answer, but the way he stepped closer, his strong, massive body looming above me, felt like one. My pulse quickened as I stood, our bodies separated only by the flimsy wooden barrier. My fingers found the latch before I could stop myself. The door creaked softly as I opened it and stepped inside. Shadow didn't move as I approached, his breathing calm and steady, but the tension in the air wrapped around me like a storm cloud. I reached out, letting my hand glide over his neck, his warmth soaking into me. My breath caught as he shifted, pressing the weight of his body ever so slightly against me. "Shadow," I breathed, my voice trembling. It was wrong, I knew it, so terribly wrong, but in that moment it didn't matter. My hands wandered across his body, feeling the ripple of his muscles, the heat of him, the undeniable strength that sent a shiver through me. My fingers traced the line of his shoulders lower, lingering longer than they should. I pressed my cheek against his side, my heart racing. The scent of him, earthy, strong, and wild, filled my lungs, making me lightheaded. His tail swished softly against my legs, pulling me further into a haze I didn't want to escape. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The safe, predictable life I'd clung to felt like a distant memory, and all I could think about was the here and now. This connection that shouldn't exist but did undeniably. The sound of my phone buzzing on the nearby table snapped me out of it. My eyes flew open, and I stumbled back, my cheeks flushed and my breathing erratic. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands. It was a text from Mark. "Miss you. Can't wait to come home." A wave of guilt hit me like a punch to the stomach. I turned back to Shadow, who stood there unmoving, watching me with those knowing eyes. He wasn't just a horse anymore. He was a secret I couldn't share, a line I had already crossed, even if I didn't want to admit it. I knew I had to stop, but I also knew I wouldn't. I spent the next day pretending everything was normal. I tried to busy myself with ranch chores, mending fences, sweeping the barn, anything to keep my mind off the night before. But no matter how hard I worked, the memory of Shadow's warmth lingered on my skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel his muscles beneath my touch, the way his presence consumed me. Mark called again that afternoon. His voice was cheerful, filled with plans for his return home. I forced myself to smile, to laugh at his jokes, but every word felt like a lie. "You sound distracted," he said suddenly, his tone shifting. "Just tired," I replied quickly, brushing my hand through my hair. "This place is a lot of work. Maybe you should sell it after all," he offered gently. "Come home. You don't need to do this on your own." The words made my stomach twist. Come home? To what? To the life I once thought was enough? I muttered an excuse to end the call, and when I hung up, I felt a lump in my throat. Mark didn't understand. No one did. By the time evening fell, I found myself back at the stable, the pull to see Shadow stronger than ever. I told myself it was just to check on him, just to make sure he was fed and settled for the night. But as I stepped into the barn, I knew I was lying to myself. Shadow stood in his stall, his head turning toward me the moment I entered. My pulse quickened, that familiar thrill shooting through me. I approached him slowly, my hands trembling as I reached for him. "Why can't I stay away?" I whispered, my voice breaking. He stepped closer, his breath warm against my skin, and I felt the air grow thick around us. My fingers trailed along his neck, down to his broad shoulders, and I let my body lean into him. The sensation was overwhelming. The heat of him, the solid strength beneath my touch. I closed my eyes as my hands wandered further, tracing the curve of his back, feeling every inch of him. My breaths came faster, shallow and uneven, and I knew I was losing control. Shadow shifted again, his weight pressing back against me, and a soft sound escaped my lips before I could stop it. It felt forbidden, dangerous, and I didn't care. The stable door creaked suddenly, and my eyes flew open, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I turned toward the sound. George stood in the doorway, his face shadowed by the dim light. My breath caught as he looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're spending a lot of time out here," he said slowly, his tone laced with suspicion. He's a lot of work," I stammered, trying to sound casual, but the words felt hollow. My cheeks burned, and I turned away, avoiding his gaze. George lingered for a moment longer before muttering, "Don't forget, horses like Shadow are unpredictable. Careful you don't let him get too close." The warning hung heavy in the air as he turned and walked out, leaving me alone with Shadow once again. I exhaled shakily, running a hand through my hair. He was right. I was getting too close. But it was already too late. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced across the room. Mark's words, George's warning, they swirled in my mind, taunting me. I told myself I'd stay away from Shadow, that I'd give myself space to think. But by morning, I was already in the stable again. Shadow was waiting, his dark eyes fixed on me as I approached. My heart thudded in my chest, a strange mixture of excitement and dread coursing through me. He stepped toward me as I entered the stall, his massive frame towering over me, but instead of fear, all I felt was longing. "I don't know what's wrong with me," I whispered, reaching up to run my hand down his neck. His coat was warm, smooth beneath my fingers, and the simple act of touching him sent a shiver through me. Shadow nuzzled his muzzle against my shoulder, his breath soft against my skin. I let my body sink into him, pressing my cheek to his powerful chest. His warmth enveloped me, a comfort I couldn't explain, and for a moment, I let myself forget everything, Mark, George, the life I was supposed to return to. It was just us. My hands wandered again, tracing the hard lines of his body, feeling the strength beneath his coat. I shouldn't have. I knew that, but I couldn't stop myself. My breathing quickened, my skin flushed as I pressed closer, letting the line between right and wrong blur until it disappeared completely. Shadow shifted his weight, pressing against me in return, and I gasped softly, the sound breaking the silence of the barn. My fingers gripped his mane, steadying myself, as my mind spiraled further into something I couldn't control. "You feel it too, don't you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't expect an answer, but the way he stilled, the way he leaned into me, it was enough. The line had been crossed long ago, but in that moment I didn't care. I wanted more. The barn door creaked open suddenly, and I froze. "Nora!" George's voice echoed through the stable. I stumbled back, my heart racing as Shadow snorted softly, oblivious to the chaos in my chest. I smoothed my clothes quickly, my hands shaking as I turned to face the door. George was standing there, his brow furrowed, his sharp gaze cutting into me. "What are you doing in here so early?" he asked, suspicion lacing his tone. "Just checking on Shadow," I replied, forcing a smile, though my voice came out shaky. "He gets restless in the mornings." George didn't move, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long before he finally nodded. "Be careful, Nora. That horse isn't like the others." As he turned and walked out, I slumped against the wooden wall, my pulse pounding in my ears. He was right. Shadow wasn't like the others. And neither was I. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't keep doing this. Someone was going to find out. Someone was going to see what I'd already let myself become. But as I looked back at Shadow, standing calm and steady, his dark eyes still watching me, I knew the truth. I wasn't going to stop. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope, every step a dangerous balancing act. I tried to distract myself, fixing the fence, cleaning the house, anything to keep me away from the barn. But it was no use. My mind always wandered back to Shadow, to the way he felt, the way he looked at me as though he could see through all my carefully guarded secrets. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of orange and red, I found myself standing outside the stable again. I tried to convince myself that I was just checking on him, that I wouldn't cross any lines this time. But as soon as I saw him, I knew I was lying. Shadow stood there in the fading light, his black coat glistening, his muscles shifting as he turned toward me. My heart raced as I stepped into the stall, closing the door quietly behind me. He didn't move as I approached, his gaze locked on mine, unblinking. "You're driving me crazy," I whispered, my voice trembling. I reached out, running my fingers through his mane. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, but I didn't care. I let my hand slide down his neck, lingering too long, my skin heating as I traced the hard lines of his body. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing into my touch, and I gasped softly, my breath catching in my throat. The connection between us was undeniable now, so overwhelming that it made my head spin. I leaned into him, pressing my face against his strong chest, breathing in the musky scent of him. The world outside didn't exist. There was no ranch, no Mark, no rules. It was just the two of us, wrapped in the kind of silence that felt like a secret no one else would understand. "Why do I keep coming back to you?" I whispered, my voice breaking. Shadow shifted again, his weight pressing back against me, and I felt a shiver roll down my spine. My hands wandered lower, tracing his shoulders, then his broad chest. My fingers trembled as I explored him, the forbidden nature of it all making my heart race faster. I don't know how long I stood there, touching him, losing myself completely. I only pulled away when I heard a sound outside, footsteps crunching against the gravel path. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stepped back, my breathing ragged. I quickly smoothed my clothes and wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to calm the panic racing through me. The footsteps grew louder until they stopped just outside the stall. "Nora!" George's voice broke the silence, and I flinched. I turned slowly, forcing a casual smile as I stepped out of the stall. "George, didn't expect you here so late." He narrowed his eyes slightly, glancing from me to Shadow. "You sure spend a lot of time with that horse," he said, his tone heavy with suspicion. "He's been restless," I lied, shrugging as though it were nothing. "I just want to make sure he's okay." George didn't look convinced, but after a long moment he nodded. "Just be careful," he muttered, turning to leave. "People might start talking." His words hit me like a slap, and I stood frozen as he walked away. People might start talking. The warning echoed in my mind, filling me with a mix of fear and shame. But as I turned back to Shadow, his dark eyes watching me with that same steady gaze, the fear faded. He was mine, at least in these moments, and no one else would ever understand. I leaned against the stall door, my breathing still shaky, and whispered softly, "This isn't over." And I meant it. The guilt was becoming harder to ignore. I spent the days avoiding my phone, letting Mark's texts pile up unanswered. I couldn't bring myself to talk to him, couldn't lie to him while my mind and body burned with thoughts I shouldn't be having. The nights, though, the nights were mine. It was raining when I returned to the stable again. The sound of water drummed against the roof, a constant hum that made the air feel heavier than usual. I hesitated at the door, staring into the shadows of the barn where Shadow stood, still and waiting. The steady beat of his breath reached me even from a distance, pulling me in like a magnet. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. My clothes were damp from the rain, clinging to my skin as I moved toward him. Shadow turned his head, those dark eyes meeting mine. I swallowed hard, my pulse thudding in my ears as I reached out, my fingertips brushing his coat. "Do you know what you're doing to me?" I whispered, my voice breaking. He shifted closer, his sheer size overwhelming me. I let my hands wander over his neck, my fingers curling into his mane. My breath quickened, shallow and uneven, as I traced the hard line of his shoulders, feeling the ripple of muscle beneath my touch. The world outside blurred into nothing, no rain, no guilt, no rules. Just this. Just him. I pressed my cheek against his side, his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of my shirt. My hands wandered lower, following the curve of his back, my touch bolder now, lingering in places that made my head spin. I closed my eyes, breathing in the musky scent of him as the rain pounded harder against the barn roof, drowning out everything else. For the first time in my life, I didn't care about the consequences. All I wanted was him. My body trembled as I leaned into him further, letting the forbidden line between us vanish completely. My hands gripped his mane, steadying myself, and a soft sound escaped my lips, a sound I'd never made before. Shadow shifted, pressing against me in return, and my knees nearly gave out as the heat of him overwhelmed me. A sharp noise outside, footsteps in the rain, sent a jolt of panic through me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I turned toward the door. My heart raced, my skin flushed, as I listened to the sound grow closer. The barn door creaked open, and I froze. "Nora!" Mark's voice cut through the silence like a knife. I turned slowly, my face pale, as Mark stepped into the barn. He was drenched from the rain, his expression unreadable as he looked from me to Shadow. The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. I could feel Shadow's presence behind me, the heat still lingering on my skin, and I knew I looked guilty, too guilty. I couldn't sleep, I said finally, forcing the words out. "I thought I'd check on him." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze lingering on me. "At this hour? In the rain?" I nodded, trying to look casual, but my hands were still shaking. Mark stepped closer, his eyes moving to Shadow, who stood calm and unmoving, as if none of this mattered. Something flickered in Mark's expression, something I couldn't place, but he didn't say another word. He just turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me alone again. I slumped against the stall door, my breathing unsteady. I knew it wouldn't be the last time Mark questioned me, and I knew I couldn't keep this hidden forever. But as I turned back to Shadow, his dark eyes steady on mine, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to stop. The tension in the house was unbearable. Mark didn't say anything more about the night he found me in the barn, but his eyes watched me differently now. He'd become distant, his words clipped, as though he could feel the growing divide between us. I avoided him as much as possible, throwing myself deeper into the work on the ranch, or at least pretending to. But every evening, as the sky turned dark and the house grew quiet, I found myself back in the stable, drawn to Shadow like a moth to flame. That night, everything changed. The barn was silent except for the occasional creak of wood and the soft shuffle of Shadow's hooves. I stepped into his stall, the now familiar thrill running through me as he turned to face me. My fingers reached for him automatically, tracing the curve of his neck, his coat warm beneath my touch. "You're the only thing that makes sense anymore," I whispered, my voice trembling. Shadow stood still, his breathing steady, his massive frame towering over me. I leaned closer, pressing my cheek to his chest, his warmth seeping into me like it always did. My hands wandered lower, bolder now, knowing how far I'd already fallen. I closed my eyes, my breath coming faster as I sank into him, letting the world around me disappear. I could feel every ripple of his muscles, every shift of his weight, and it sent a wave of heat through me so intense I thought I might shatter. And then the barn door slammed open. "Nora!" Mark's voice was sharp, slicing through the haze like a blade. I froze, my body going rigid, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I turned slowly, my face pale, as Mark stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of anger and something worse, realization. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was nothing I could say. My hands shook, my chest heaving, as the truth hung heavy in the air between us. "You've been spending too much time out here," he said, stepping closer. "And now I know why." His words hit me like a slap, the accusation ringing in my ears. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to deny it, but I couldn't. The look in his eyes told me he already knew. He'd seen enough to understand what I couldn't explain. I didn't mean for. Don't, he snapped, his voice cold. I don't want to hear it. Shadow shifted behind me, the sound of his hooves breaking the silence. Mark's gaze flickered to the stallion, his jaw tightening, and for a moment, I thought he might say more. But instead, he turned and stormed out of the barn, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. I stood there, frozen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a stone. My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, my hands trembling as I buried my face against Shadow's side. It's over, I whispered, the words breaking as they left me. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Mark knew. I'd been caught, and there was no going back now. The silence in the house was heavier than ever. Mark hadn't spoken a word to me since the night in the barn. He moved around me like I didn't exist, his eyes cold and unreadable. I'd ruined everything, and I knew it. But the worst part? I couldn't bring myself to regret it. I avoided him, spending my days outside, pretending to busy myself with the ranch. But no matter where I was, I felt the pull of the barn of Shadow. My nights were spent replaying everything that had happened. The lines I had crossed, the moments that changed me forever. That evening, I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of Mark's silence, the storm brewing inside me. I needed to see Shadow. I needed him. The barn was dark when I arrived, the air thick with stillness. Shadow stood there, waiting, his dark form blending into the shadows. My heart raced as I stepped inside the stall, closing the door softly behind me. You're all I have left, I whispered, my voice breaking. I ran my hands through his mane, my touch desperate, my body trembling. Shadow stood still, his breathing steady, as though he could feel everything I couldn't put into words. I leaned into him, pressing my face to his warm neck, my tears spilling against his coat. You don't judge me, I murmured, my voice barely audible. You don't see me as broken. My hands wandered along his body again, the familiar heat of him spreading through me, soothing the ache that had taken hold in my chest. I knew this was wrong, I knew I was spiraling, but Shadow was the only thing that felt real anymore. A noise behind me made me freeze. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and there stood Mark, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. He must have followed me. Nora, he said hoarsely, his voice barely more than a whisper. What the hell are you doing? I stumbled back, my hands trembling as I tried to speak, but no words came. Mark's expression hardened, his lips curling in anger as he stepped closer. I knew something was wrong, but this, he shook his head, his voice rising. You're sick, Nora. Do you hear me? Sick. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I backed into the stall wall, Shadow's presence looming behind me. My mind raced, my body shaking as Mark pointed a trembling finger at me. I can't even look at you, he spat, his voice dripping with disgust. You're not the woman I married. The truth hung between us, undeniable now. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I had destroyed my marriage, my life, everything I thought I knew about myself. Mark turned on his heel and stormed out of the barn, slamming the door so hard that it echoed through the silence. I sank to the ground, my breath ragged, my tears hot against my cheeks. Shadow stepped closer, his head lowering to nuzzle me softly, as though he understood. I clung to him, my fingers curling into his mane as I whispered, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But it was too late. There was no coming back from this. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. More stories are on the way. Stay tuned.